Hey everyone, Jake Lloyd-Bacon here.
Along with Paul Bianchi.
And Alexandra Hoy.
Hey, we all host different shows on Dragon Wagon Radio.
We do, but that's not what we're here to talk about.
Not at all. We are here to talk about Dungeons and Dragon Wagon,
a narrative podcast series in which we venture into a mythical land for a D&D inspired role-playing game.
Alexandra and I are joined by Matt Hinksman and a very special guest of quest for each chapter of an epic saga in which we must take on the roles of half-orcs, dark elves, and more as we fight our way through a fantastical land of peril, drama, and often hilarity.
All of which is controlled by me, the Dungeon Master, and the players' chance rolls of the die.
And our show is for everyone. Even if you know nothing about D&D or role-playing games, we've got you covered.
That's right. Our game sessions are highly edited, easy to follow, sound designed from top to bottom, and completely immersive.
Yeah, our episodes sound more like a well-produced radio drama than an RPG show.
So what are you waiting for? Join the adventure on Dungeons and Dragon Wagon at dndwpod.com or wherever you find great podcasts.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers and Quiller Nation, to Don't Quill the Messenger, your favorite podcast about the Shakespeare Authorship Question. A little bit of business before I introduce this episode's special guest. I want to remind you can support the show by becoming an official member of the Quiller Nation as a patron through our Patreon account, where you can choose the level of participation that is right for you. Just head to don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com, and click the Patreon link there on the page, and you'll see a variety of exclusive perks only available to patrons at various levels, including monthly bonus features. And I'll give you a teaser. This month's bonus feature is going to include an exploration into two sets of the Bard's famous lovers and his successful depiction of both juvenile love versus mature love. And that's the only hint I'm going to give you. And you have to be at the right level in order to access that bonus feature, which will be coming before the end of the month. You can also find details about how you can get entered into the Quiller of the Month contest. That's our monthly contest where we acknowledge one of our patrons each month and they receive a prize. Our monthly winner receives an item of their choosing from the Quiller swag shop and a shout out on this month's shows. I'll be announcing this month's winner at the end of this episode. If you haven't visited the swag shop, you should do that. There's some wonderful merchandise there and you can wear your DQTM merch with pride. It's great conversation starters. I wear my t-shirts. I bring my coffee mug. People ask me all the time. When we were wearing masks, I had my Quiller mask, and that caused a lot of conversation with folks. So go find some Quiller swag and swag up if you would like. I'd also like to thank all of you who have already signed up as patrons. We are so humbled by the early response and the swiftly growing numbers that we are seeing. We can't do the show without you, and we're so thrilled to have your support. Thank you, all of you who have already gone to the Patreon account and joined up as a member of the Quiller Nation. Now, let's go ask some questions, shall we? My guest today is author Syril Levin Kline. She is an educator, journalist, theater director. That's my kind of person. And a performer who believes that challenging academic orthodoxy can lead to new insights and discoveries that enhance all fields of learning. She believes that writers create within the context of their experience, go figure, and that by helping students connect an author with his or her work, we can enable those students to see relationships between their own learning and their own work, their own thinking and their own writing. She is the award-winning author of Shakespeare's Changeling, a controversial literary historical novel focused on the Shakespeare Authorship Question. Syril, welcome to the program.
Hi, Stephen. Good to talk with you.
I'm so thrilled to have you. I've been saying for quite some time that I believe that this is one of the avenues that those who are in pursuit of the truth need to explore further. Historical fiction is just blowing up the world right now. I mean, if you're a fan of any of the regular series that have been created through historical fiction, whether it's Vikings, Outlander, my wife and I right now are in the middle of The Last Kingdom, which we are very much enjoying. Then you know how popular this genre is and has become and continues to be. And I believe that a work like yours has the ability to reach new audiences and new people and introduce them to the Shakespeare Authorship Question. So I'm so thrilled to have you.
Well, thank you. The book was written so that it could be entertainment that would appeal to people who are overwhelmed by the amount of research into the Earl of Oxford writing under the pen name Shakespeare. So it was suggested by David Lloyd Krieger that this book be written as entertainment. And my late husband, Peter, ended up writing 3 volumes about the 17th Earl of Oxford and his relationships with Queen Elizabeth, with women, with writing. And so I used his book and the research of many, many, many other people who've been Oxfordians, I guess post-Stratfordians, whatever title you want to use, for really for ages, even since the Shakespeare authorship was known in England.
Now, is this the first book you've ever written, or is this a series of books for you? Like, tell me a little bit about your history as an author.
All right. My first book, my husband and I wrote together. It's called The Butterfly Dreams. And it's a spiritual journey of a guy, a hard-nosed consultant who gets picked up by a UFO and learns a few spiritual lessons. So I was a consumer reporter for the South Bend Tribune. This book right now, Shakespeare's Changeling, I'm working on a sequel written from Anne Cecil's story, not only because stories with women protagonists are really important now, but this woman is a key element in many Shakespeare plays. And Lord Oxford's life story is told in many of the plays. So writing about Anne Cecil de Vere is something I'm working on it. It's another historical novel, but it's the story told from her point of view.
Well, she is definitely a wonderful character in the grand scheme of this story. And I think, I think a very underappreciated character. And so I'm glad to hear that she's going to be the focus, the sort of the protagonist of her own version of the tale. I think from her perspective, we could learn a lot about how things happened, why things happened, and a lot about the power and influence of not only her father, William Cecil, and her brother, Robert Cecil, but also her mother, Mildred Cecil, who I think played a larger role in all of this than perhaps we all know yet.
Yes, well, Mildred was one of the most highly educated women of the time, as was Queen Elizabeth I. And I'm very sure that this had a direct effect on the subjects Anne was taught. She receives a Greek Bible as a gift from her husband, so she obviously was educated in Greek and probably Latin to some extent. So this was a woman that was very wise. However, she was very mistreated. And I'm using basically the same storyline that I used for her in Shakespeare's Changeling, but it's told from her point of view. For example, if I may, the idea that she might have been pregnant when Oxford goes to Italy at the Queen's behest, and there's a baby that dies. And so she can't go on this trip. She's got to take care of this pregnancy because this would be possibly the next Earl. But she has a miscarriage and loses it. And so something has to be done so that there is a baby. And when Oxford's cousin Howard searches him out in France and tells him, your wife has given birth to a child that's not yours, and basically figures out nobody has an 11-month pregnancy, he comes back furious as heck and casts her off. He just won't live with her. And he refuses to see Burleigh when he docks on his on the ship. He takes a wherry to where they are, and he refuses to see either William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, or his wife Anne. And there's a daughter born that for 5 years he totally believes that it's not his, and he's very convinced of this. And there's more, but something happens so that Anne has this second pregnancy, and what could that be?
I always felt that another, character in the story that is such a tragic figure early in her life and must have been shaped by the early trauma that she experienced is Elizabeth de Vere, that eldest daughter whom her father rejects for the first 5 to 7 years of her life. And then later on, he sort of, I believe, tries to make up for it as much as he can. And I think we see that in the writings. If you look at the Shakespearean canon, there are so many instances of father-daughter relationships and father-daughter reunions, and fathers who first reject or cast out a daughter and then later repent. One of my favorites, of course, is Much Ado About Nothing, where Leonardo casts Hero out, almost strikes her down dead right there, if it weren't for the fact that the priest kind of intermediates and says, wait a minute, I have this plan. Let's go with this secret plan. And then later, of course, we learn, Hero is pure and she's been wrongly accused and wrongly besmirched. And I think that there are reflections there in the life of Oxford that are just too strong to ignore.
I'm sure that there are. I think that a daughter being something that's basically property that secures a marriage for you, an auspicious, wonderful marriage, because these are actually tools, and that Anne was, in a sense, because William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, was the keeper of the royal wards. I don't believe he was Lord Burleigh when that happened, but I believe he becomes Lord Burleigh when his daughter Anne marries the 17th Earl of Oxford. And by the way, in order for him to marry, Lord Burleigh, William Cecil, strikes down the match that the Earl of Oxford's father, who died when the Earl of Oxford, the 17th Earl, was 12, he annuls that marriage to enable Cecil to marry his daughter Anne to Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. So there's some, and also we know that he controlled Oxford's inheritance and his money for so long, and that in the letters that are extant between Lord Burleigh and the Earl of Oxford, there are many, many references to come home. Don't be on this trip anymore. You need to come home because of your money. Well, if in fact Anne was pregnant and lost Oxford's baby, he doesn't mention that. He just wants him to come home. And there is some skullduggery to an 11-month pregnancy. And of course, Oxford would figure that out. So there's a lot of manipulation from William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, with the Earl of Oxford's life, with his love life, with his finances, all of the surveys of the properties. And I'm jumping ahead right now with what I'm about to say, but this is an earl who was descended from a family that had been warriors since 1066. And so it's in English history. They didn't just pop out of the country ground in Stratford. Losing my train. How does a man with so much wealth lose all of his money and sell 54 estates in his lifetime? And the answer that I've come up in the novel is that he was very busy producing plays for Queen Elizabeth I at court, and later eventually through the front man, William Shaftesbury of Stratford, in playhouses. In fact, when he comes home furious with his wife for having this baby that he totally is convinced is not his, the first playhouse comes up on 1576 on the Thames River. So it's almost like he's channeling his energy in a different place. But why would an earl with all of his resources have been near broke and almost poor? my conclusion in the novel is he spent his money financing theatrical productions. And even then, that was a costly experience. So
my wife would absolutely agree with you, because we we have, through our lifetimes, I created and ran a Shakespeare festival in Southern California for nearly a decade, and then 2 different theaters in the Los Angeles area for 8 years total. And now here in Southern Oregon, we are right in the midst of rehearsals for A Midsummer Night's Dream as part of the Rogue Valley Shakespeare Company, and doing Shakespeare in the Park here in Southern Oregon. And I know she would absolutely agree with you that that's where most of our money goes, is to help me pursue my passion and addiction to my craft. And so I can definitely relate to that. There's certainly relevance that stands the test of time there when it comes to theater artists. You know, once we call it the acting bug for a reason. And when you've been bit, you've been bit. And my experience is, if you spend too long off the stage, you start to get itchy feet for the boards, as it were. And it sounds to me like Edward was a kindred spirit in that way, in my estimation.
No, I agree with you. I think that he was. And I believe that I wrote so many drafts of this book. And a couple of scenes I had was that he is on stage in a play presented at his father's Hedingham Castle, without his parents being aware that he's the one on stage as a young child. And he just steals the show. It's a play that since the 16th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere's father, had a troupe of players, maintained a troupe of players at Hedingham Castle. It's not impossible that there were shows. And then here's a young boy who is smitten with the theater and smitten with translation. He was a polyglot. He spoke many languages. And so learning these when you're young is the easiest way to learn a language, to be totally immersed in it. And it's also interesting to note that not only his theater life, he gets bitten by the theater bug, bitten by the translation bug, fluent in all these languages. He reads and notates books and poems and stories that were not even Englished at the time. They weren't even written in English. So it makes you realize how much Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, knew as a wealth of information, gleaning it from books written in foreign languages long before the man from Stratford was even born, and books were not in English yet for the average reader, which, by the way, how could someone afford to buy books if they were from the lower to middle classes, when books could only be afforded by wealthy people at the time? So that's an interesting thing. I was recently at a book signing to celebrate Independent Bookstore Day, and that was how I led off. That when you feel that, you know that the Shakespeare plays have a wealth of subject matter in them, including how to relate to royalty and be a nobleman, which Lord Oxford wrote the Latin translation preface to the Courtier. You see that if a person didn't have access to books financially, or access to the languages that they were written in before, before that was beginning to happen with the printing press, if people could not even read, then where did this stuff come from a man from Stratford who didn't have the resources financially to acquire books? And there's also no evidence he went to that grammar school, that school in Stratford. There's absolutely no evidence of anyone by his name attending there.
And you address these timelines in your novel, and that's part of your storyline, I take it, as the novel progresses through. And so one of the questions I like to ask you when it comes to historical fiction is, how do you decide when and where you're going to, say, veer from the actual historical record, or better yet, maybe not veer from the actual historical record, but supplement or include things that cannot necessarily be proven in the historical record? How do you make those decisions as an author when you're creating the novel?
That's a very, very good question. And I'm glad you asked that. The first thing I did was create a timeline for all the characters. So these horizontal handwritten lines on a piece of paper, Queen Elizabeth I, Lord Burleigh. It's very much like what his lines were vertical, but what Charlton Ogburn has in the appendix of The Mysterious William Shakespeare, there's a timeline between the Earl of Oxford and Shaftesbury of Stratford.
See, and in my mind, I'm seeing you like in a study or an office with pieces of paper and photos and things plastered all over the wall, like an FBI crime scene trying to solve a murder. Is it similar to that kind of a thing or no?
Good for you. I think you're right. I felt that we are looking at someone who had the time, the method, the motivation to write these plays. And it's sort of like putting a crime scene together. I had my sticky notes, but then I transferred it into I think it was a 20-page horizontal description of everybody in the story, including Ben Jonson, when he was born, when he starts writing his works, when he starts on the folio, and the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery. And by the way, the Earl of Oxford's daughters, his 3 daughters, made some really interesting marriages in the literary and theater world. And the middle child, unfortunately, did not do that, married someone else, but he also was related to the theater world. So her husband, Lord Norris, but not to the extent of the other daughters. And I've jumped here, but I had all these people diagrammed out in terms of their birth and so forth. So yes, it was like a crime scene investigation, because the real crime is that the man in my novel who acts as the front man, who everybody believes, fellow writers at the time think this guy is a fraud. They're saying it. Ben Jonson is hinting at it in the first folio. Look not on his picture, but this book. So I think that if people at the time were suspicious, then it very well could have been that a nobleman who had lots of reasons, many reasons, to hide his identity under a pen name, would have a distant cousin through the 15th Earl of Oxford, his grandmother, who had some kind of connection, Ogburn suspected, to the Arden family. So I just took what I knew about these people and I wove a story. But mostly I used historical fact, but I had to do some dramatic creativity in order to explain what happened between Anne losing the baby and pregnant again, and who would have the most at stake if she didn't produce a male heir, and lose the fortune. So there was a lot going on, because when Oxford left for Italy, he did not mention Anne in his will. He mentioned his cousin Horatio. So there are just some interesting pieces that weave together quite dramatically.
Well, throughout more than 3 years now and more than 80 episodes of this program, we have had a lot of authors on, many of them scholarly authors, and we have promoted a lot of books to our listeners and recommended that they purchase certain books along the way. Many of those books are dense with page after page after page of footnotes and references and citations. Is your novel full of that kind of thing? Or do you say, I'll let the scholars do that. This is more for entertainment, is more to introduce people to the story, to the idea. And if they want to go dig into the scholarly novels, they can do that somewhere else.
Well, I mentioned the Shakespeare Oxford Society at the end of the book. When I talk about, I have several pages on describing how I took the historical facts, which are, they're heavy. And they're heavy for someone like me. But I poured over this stuff, and it took me several years to write this book. It doesn't spring from the head of Zeus, fully blown. It was.
I love that reference. That's a magnificent reference. The whole Pallas Athena. That's beautiful. That's brilliant. Pallas Athena, the spear shaker. I love that. You're
yes,
brilliant.
Yes, sir. Thank you. You're sweet. I appreciate that. So what I did was, even today, after 20 some years or more of being an Oxfordian and seeing new things come out and reading things, it's a lot. It's heavy. I think Ogburn's book is about 900 pages. And I feel very fortunate. My husband, Peter, went to see him in Beaufort, South Carolina, which, by the way, isn't far from where I am. And he signed a book for us, which is a cherished possession. And even though my husband, Peter, has passed away, I have a 3-volume manuscript of his book that he wrote about Oxford that hasn't even been published yet. It could be. So this has been, I would say, an act of love. Again, David Lloyd Krieger, who sponsored the debates in the 1980s, the Supreme Court debates over the authorship, was the one that said, write something entertaining that will introduce people to this idea.
Well, I absolutely agree. As I said earlier, I fully agree. I think dramatization is also in our favor. If we can get something on the stage that can be performed in front of people, I think we need to use Oxford's own technique to reveal him to the world, which is put it on the stage, put it in drama, create a storyline, rich characters and a dialogue, and perform it for the masses. And I think that if we follow that template, we'll find ourselves further along than we have been in the last 100 years of this debate. And so I admire you for what you've done. And not only that, but there are so many people out there who say, someday I'm going to write a book. Someday I'm going to write a book. I am going to write a novel. I'm going to write the great American novel. I have an unfinished novel in a box myself in my office that someday I keep saying I'm going to get to and complete. And so I have a great amount of respect for you for actually going through with it and doing it. Putting your money where your mouth is and walking the walk rather than just talking the talk. So I think that's incredible. And, speaking of talking the talk, the next question I have for you is, what is your process for creating dialogue between historical characters when we absolutely, except for letters that have been written, really don't have a clue of what was said and how it was said and who talked to whom? How do you go about that? As a director, actor, dialogue, of course, is crucially important to me. So I'm real curious about your dialogue creation process.
All right. I'll get to that in a moment, but I want to let you know that I took a piece of work called The Adventures of Master F.I., which was attributed to Gascoigne, but it's believed to have been written by the Earl of Oxford in 1573. And I turned it into a play. It's a play. It hasn't been performed yet, but it could certainly make a good reading. And a lot of the phrases used in Master F.I. are phrases that are used in Shakespeare plays, like Beatrice leading apes in hell because she doesn't get married. That's in there. There's a whole lot of different phrases in The Adventures of Master F.I., which is from the book 100 Sundry Flowers.
Would you be willing to send me a copy of your play? I would love to read it.
Oh, sure. I've got to dig it up because I moved from Maryland to here in Somerville, South Carolina, which is just outside Charleston. And not everything is unpacked because I need more bookshelves. Oh, God.
Don't we all?
But I didn't answer your question about the dialogue. So I will be happy to, after we get off, you can give me your information where to send it.
Excellent.
So you said dialogue.
Yes.
The interesting thing I learned was you can't write thou and thee, and you cannot ever write a book for historical fiction in the Shakespeare time period using exactly the way you think Elizabethans would have talked at the time. And even writing dialect in a novel these days is questionable because it could also, insult people if you're writing a dialect that isn't something a reader can easily read. So my goal, here's the thing. Shakespeare of Stratford is a guy who wants to succeed. He wants to get away from his bucolic existence as this grain merchant and his drunken father, the alderman. And he has this relative related to the Arden side of the family from the 15th Earl of Oxford's wife, Elizabeth Trussell, which, by the way, is mentioned in Ogburn's book. And he wants to succeed. So what you've got is a character who is striving to improve himself, who has the opportunity to connect with this distant kinsman who is a playwright. One of the scenes in the book is he's over there. He sneaks away from his father. They're on a trip to London. He sneaks away and finds out there's a show, and he goes to see a play called The Famous Victories of Henry V, which was presented originally anonymously, but it's very similar to Henry V, except for some details that are removed, like the robbery of Lord Burleigh's tax collectors at Gad's Hill, which Lord Oxford was a part of. And there's a letter that's extant of Lord Burleigh complaining about this, no, excuse me. Someone wrote Lord Burleigh complaining about the robbery and letting the Earl of Oxford be involved. So we have this irascible, exciting, swashbuckling character of the Earl of Oxford. He's a jouster whose countenance shook spears. And it was said of him at the time that he was a well-known writer, which could have been a blessing, nice to be famous, or a curse. They're on to me. They know I'm writing this stuff. So we have an up-and-coming commoner from Stratford who abandons his wife and his 3 children, and 2 of them were twins, and goes to London to hook up and connect with and find work as an actor. It's the newest technology in Elizabethan England. It's a mass technology. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have fax machines. They didn't even have phones. So the way to get through to people, for example, and raise taxes so you can fight against the Spanish Armada is to write a series of plays inspiring patriotism in England. They're the history plays. And they're all in this, if you watch them consecutively, like you can do at the Stratford Festival or even at Blackfriars in Virginia, you see this connection. It's like, oh, wow. And you write this so that anybody reading this book now would have no trouble breezing through it and understanding it. And I'm also open. I have an email address in the book where people can contact me and dialogue with me. So that's always open. That dialoguing with me is an open book. I don't know if this answers your question, Stephen.
Well, it sort of does. I mean, it gives me a little bit of insight. I think gives the listeners a little bit of insight into your creative process. I find, I was mentioning earlier about some of the historical fiction that you see in television series now. And like I mentioned, my wife and I are in the middle of watching The Last Kingdom. And when it was Vikings or when it's Outlander is very fiction because, there's like time travel going on and whatnot. But when you look at shows like Vikings or The Last Kingdom and, series like that, I always find myself in the middle of an episode or in the middle of a season going to my phone and researching the actual characters that are being depicted and discovering where the writers have broken away from the history or where they have sort of, combined it all together for the essence of time, which is something that Shakespeare did as well. I mean, you look at Julius Caesar and, a number of years are all condensed into one act and time moves quickly, So every writer has done that for purposes of dramatization. But I just was wondering, how that is decided, when you go about deciding it, talking about The Last Kingdom, for instance, in history, Alfred's wife dies before him, but in the television series, he dies before her, and they use her character and take some dramatic license to make the scenes more dramatic and more intense and to increase the conflict. So just wondering if you make those choices and how you make those choices.
For example, the reason Lord Oxford would have had this issue about a baby that wasn't his and be angry about it, but and something intervening event happened, that I connected dots for. But I'd like to answer your question by reading something that I put in my book in the author's notes.
Sure.
So if you don't mind, bear with me.
Okay.
On writing dialogue for historical characters, George Bernard Shaw once said that he preferred not to write what he thought the characters had said, but rather what he thought they would have said if they had known what they were really doing. Retrospect and the judgment of history conspire to allow us to speculate on a character's thoughts, emotions, and deed. A writer builds well-constructed scenes that show characters involved in the roles they played as history unfolded. As you read this novel, step into the shoes of Lord Oxford, William Shakespeare, Queen Elizabeth I, Ben Jonson, and others, so that you can imagine how you would have performed if you had been that person.
Oh, that sums things up quite nicely. And of course, Shaw knew exactly what he was talking about. When you look at, works like St. Joan, for instance, is obviously huge historical fiction. And then, his Caesar and Cleopatra is another piece that is, giant historical fiction, not unlike Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, for instance, another play where history is condensed into, 2.5 hours on the stage. And so I totally understand the concept there. And I like that summation of what to do and how to do it. It seems to make sense to me.
Well, I felt as a writer and just as me, that I had to be as faithful to the characterizations of these people that we've read about. There are two prefaces to the book. There's a prologue, the William Shakespeare prologue, which begins it, where he's run off with manuscripts after he's seen his noble master murdered. I turned it into a murder. I didn't have him hiding somewhere else and living a life. He was, in my novel, he's murdered in 1604. And then there's the prologue, the Earl of Oxford's prologue, which is a confrontation between him and Lord Burleigh about Hamlet, that he's willing to put on this play and name names exactly who these people really were in real life. In other words, Polonius, whose original name in the first quarto is Carambus, which I find interesting. He changes it to Polonius. Ophelia being Anne, very manipulated, very controlled. And it's interesting, too, I believe it's Polonius that tells her that Oxford has more restrictions on his life than you do, walking around with a greater tether, I believe is the exact quote. So to me, it was just a matter of comparing who they were, and then being a teacher and a psychologist and looking at why would somebody do something a certain way? What would have motivated them to have gone in that direction? I mean, could it really be true that a guy who wanted to improve himself in the new mass communication at the theaters, and also has a relative that can help hoist him up there, that can hire him as an actor? It's not unusual that an up-and-coming person wanting to improve himself would do that, would seek out this person, and the nobleman would look at him suspiciously at first. In fact, there's a scene I wrote where he encounters John Lilly, who was Oxford's secretary at the time, and they're all at the Savoy, and where Oxford usually holds sort of a writing group. He's got writers that he's working with. And because they have almost like a play factory. They've got to get these history plays out.
I like to call it.
In a record time.
I like to call it Oxford's Algonquin Club. If you're familiar, with Dorothy Parker and that gang, I think it was Oxford's, own Algonquin Club that was going on there back in the day.
That's a much better way of describing it than just as a play factory, because there was drink, there was food, there was thoughts. I have a scene where they're passing around Edmund Ironside, which the censor has looked at and said, we can't put this out there. You can't do this. A royal person gets murdered. What's going on here? And Shakespeare pulls it out of the fire when Oxford angrily just says, the heck with this. I'm throwing it away. And pulls it out of the fire and rescues the play. So you have two men working together who don't always get along. And Shakespeare has this romantic fantasy about Lord Oxford's second wife, Elizabeth Trentham, which is kind of a nervy thing to do. But, and Elizabeth Trentham de Vere and Edward de Vere, 17th Earl, talk about it. And it's like, So, I mean, these are things, the things in the book that my characters experience are actual things that real people experience, including a situation of incest, not with Lord Burleigh. When you find uprighteous people who do such despicable things, and if you're doing it to save your daughter's inheritance and your position as Lord Burleigh, which you gained in 1575 when you marry your daughter to Oxford, who, by the way, didn't want to marry her and ran off.
Right.
At least, yeah. So, I mean, and they were very ill-matched. They were really, but her story, I'm going to tell her side of the story in the sequel from her point
Well,
of
you know,
view.
that is one of the few things that William Shakespeare of Stratford and Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, share in common, it would appear, is that they both were forced to marry women they did not want to marry against their will. That's one of the very few things that they actually share in common in their histories. And I've always found that ironic in a weird way, that's the one connection that we can absolutely make between their persons and their histories and their characters is they both ended up married to women they did not want to marry and both ended up abandoning those women at some point in their lifetimes.
Well, I have this thing going on in my story where, of course, I think we all learned in school that Shakespeare of Stratford got her pregnant. She was a little bit older than he was, but not by much. And so I got intrigued by the idea that in some church registry, it says that he was married to Anne Whatley of Temple Grafton, which there's no connection between that and Anne Hathaway back then. So how did they do this? Well, in my book, I decided to write that her brothers, because she was pregnant, forced Shakespeare to marry Anne Hathaway. Anne Whatley was not pregnant, and that he regretted that he hadn't married Anne Whatley because she would have understood his need to go to London and become a playwright and improve his lot. So that's the part which is the unknown of history, where I fabricated that plot device. But we do know that Anne Whatley's name is listed, which doesn't sound anything like Hathaway. Whatley, Hathaway? No, they don't even sound alike. How could any church registry make that mistake? So I played with that.
That's an interesting thing. So I'm sure you found a lot of little interesting tidbits like that where interpretation is key, and that opens the door, I would think, to sort of that fictional aspect of the historical fiction novel. Yeah.
Yeah, especially when you have something like that and you don't know why it happened. Why did this happen a certain way? Why is Anne Whatley? What? And, why are so many pieces of the historical record for Shakespeare so sketchy? So there's a lot known about the Earl of Oxford, including, in my opinion, the sad end when he dies. Because being a writer in Elizabethan England was a dangerous thing to be. There was John Stubbs, who had a hand cut off for participating in writing a pamphlet. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there were people that suffered because they were writers. So if you were a nobleman, one of the reasons you might want to keep your name kind of private and have somebody drop your place off at the stationer's register's office, you would, you'd want to be kept secret because there were different forms of execution for commoners and noblemen.
Bonner Miller Cutting has a great presentation that she delivers about the various writers of the time and the different tortures and punishments that they suffered in their lifetimes. Even Ben Jonson is one who was tortured and imprisoned. And I believe more than once. Thomas Nash is another. There are plenty of writers who suffered the rack and other forms of torture for the things that they wrote. And as you mentioned, even Stubbs, unfortunate name, ended up with a stub.
Yes.
Lost his hand. So that's true. And one of the things that she points out that I think is, part of her the point she's making there is one particular writer who we see no evidence of having ever been called in, ever been tortured, ever been questioned, ever been imprisoned, and that is the name William Shakespeare. And of course, you can't call in a pen name. You can't call a pseudonym on the carpet. It doesn't work that way.
Well, one of the sources I used was Diana Price's The Unorthodox Biography of William Shakespeare. I believe that's the full title. And she pointed out a scene where, because of Richard II, the troupe of actors were chased all over. She mentions that the Shakespeare and a troupe were pursued across the countryside because the play was considered, a dangerous play. Mm-hmm. And
it was subversive, right?
So,
it was a subversive.
Yes, subversive. And it wasn't that the Earl of Oxford was chased away from anything. It was that the guy from Stratford and the actors were running. And these actors always fascinated me, like Augustine. There were so many actors that you learn about when you study Shakespeare in junior high school and so forth. And you see these names written there. And it's like, wow, this was a real guy. Augustine Phillips, that's it. So he's in the small part. He's got a small part. And I put in Hamnet Sadler reading letters to Shakespeare's wife because she can't read. So I've got Shakespeare sending money to her.
Well, and you have famous comedians, like Kemp, for instance, who was well known for playing the comic roles. There are...
Did he do the Morris dance? Is he the one that did the Morris dance across England?
Yeah, yes, Kemp? I believe that is correct.
Okay.
And it's interesting because it's such a rich plethora of characters that surround this man and his life. As you mentioned, the writers and the writers club that he has, and you have to imagine that. I live it every day. I'm in the middle of rehearsals right now. I have a group of actors who come to my home. We're rehearsing A Midsummer Night's Dream. We discuss blocking, character choices, how to deliver certain lines, certain jokes. I always tell the actors that Midsummer Night's Dream is Shakespeare's most beautiful encapsulation of farcire. It is a true farce, and it is stuffed with jokes. Farcire, the Italian word meaning to stuff. And it's absolutely stuffed with humor, and we stuff it further with, humorous things that we come up with. And sometimes there is a discussion about, will the audience get that? Can we get away with that? Will parents be upset if they bring their children and see that? So there's, these are real things that real artists and everybody's very passionate. And, not in the middle of rehearsals, but oftentimes after rehearsals, we'll all sit around and drink a pint together as well. And, so there's food, there's drink, there's exploration, there's art, there's, theater happening at all levels in that process. And sometimes I'll even joke with the actors and say, maybe we should just join a bowling league instead, or start a softball team, or what normal people do on their weeknights after work,
Oh, golly. If you are the man, not you, but the Earl of Oxford, who's in charge of all this, and they're having their parties, and they're producing things, and they have to do costumes. They didn't have the bright theater lights that we have now, but they might have at certain points had to keep things lit. So I had to do some reading about Elizabethan theater. I even have William Shakespeare renting his father's barn on Henley Street so that Oxford's people can put on the famous victories. And he's brought it to Stratford. There were play wagons. They brought the play to Stratford. And he's going to sell tickets, and he's doing it, and his father is a drunk, and they have a fight because he wants money to drink, and Shakespeare says, no, he basically doesn't use the word, but I'm an entrepreneur. Theater is my business. I'm doing this now, Father. So including when he leaves his father to go see the famous victories when he's in London at the Curtain. I've got that staged at the Curtain Theater. And Oxford steps out on stage, and he's even mobbed by people on the street. And doesn't like it, with John Lilly pushing them out of the way and Oxford using his cane to push people back, the way a celebrity would greet it. So I put a lot of that flavor because one of my premises is that times may have changed, but human nature has not.
That's very true. And theater is very much like church in many ways. Any building can work. Any location can become a gathering place for art, just like any location can become a gathering place for prayer. And theater artists are very religious in their pursuit of their craft. But I can tell you, I have rehearsed and performed in so many different strange and unusual places. A barn is definitely one of them. We performed an entire play in an aircraft hangar once in my career. So, I mean, it's an interesting aspect to think about throughout history. And even, again, referring to A Midsummer Night's Dream, you see these rude mechanicals, these basically day laborers who get together at night and rehearse a play in the middle of the woods. And that still is happening. Most of the actors that I work with all have regular day jobs, and at night they come to my house and we rehearse a play. And what's the goal? The goal of them is to become made men, 6 pence a day or nothing in Pyramus, right? So,
yes. And they rehearse in the woods, so their devices.
That's correct.
Known.
We don't want people to know what it is that we're doing. We don't want them to steal our stuff. That's the thing. We don't want them to steal our play, steal our jokes, steal our gags, right? That's basically what Peter Quince is saying at that point. And so
yes.
I love that all of this does surround the theatrical world. And I believe that your novel is something that people will enjoy because of that, and hopefully opens the door for them to do the research into the scholarly stuff that sometimes can, as you point out, bog people down and be a little too dense and a little too thick.
Yeah, it does that. It does that to me sometimes, but you have to follow it to know what's going on. And, but I think for the average person, this is new territory for them. They've never been thought about, why should we even care about Shakespeare? It's 2022. And again, if you go on the premise that human nature is the same, the times have changed, technology has changed, certain things around us have changed, but not human nature.
Look at how we cleave to our identities, again, touching on that. So as you point in your novel, you have, William Shakespeare, the grain dealer, land dealer, who is trying to change his identity. We know that he is trying to obtain a coat of arms for his family, right? That's part of the historical record.
Yes.
We see hints of him potentially being an actor and being a Peter Quince or a Nick Bottom type who is trying to transcend his mundane existence on the boards of the stage. And if you think about the society at the time and the titles that people had, it was all a part of their identity. And you have to think about then, what are we if we lose our identity? Have we always been just the letters after our names or the letters before our names, as in doctor, right? Or professor. Mm-hmm. Are we the pre-designed signature lines that we use when we send emails? Mine says artistic director of Rogue Valley Shakespeare Company and host of Don't Quill the Messenger pod. Is that my identity, though? Are our identities tied to the signature blocks that we create at the ends of our emails? Or are our identities actually tied, and this is where I believe Shakespeare masters life in his works, are our identities tied to, at first, being loyal children and then stalwart friends, later on supportive spouses, loving parents, and even guiding mentors through what I would say are the 7 ages of man, as so well encapsulated in As You Like It. Are those our identities? And should we rather cleave to those identities than our titles and our positions and the letters after our names? And I think that there's a lot of that in the canon. And I think there's a lot of that through the lives of the people involved in the canon, and as well as the characters that are based on some of those real people.
That's interesting that you say that, because it makes me think that Lord Oxford, towards the end of his days, is more concerned with the art rather than the name. And the name Shakespeare first appears hyphenated in print. So I think there's something about certain people that I know that are artists and writers and musicians who would rather just do the art, and that's all that's important to them. Create, to be the creator of something magnificent. And maybe that's, for some people, that's enough. It you know what I mean? It doesn't, except we know that it was mentioned in several different publications in Queen Elizabeth's time that Lord Oxford was best in comedy for writing it, that he was a known poet, that he was known in his time, and the rest of the phrase is, if his doings could be made known. In other words, if his name could be associated with them. So it makes you wonder, did the idea of being creative absorb everything? And that was his identity, which was, since he had to give it up. And there's a whole list of reasons as to why he would give up his identity. I can go into them, but there are so many. My husband had an actual list of why someone in the nobility, who everybody thinks can do whatever the hell they want. No, it wasn't like that. And Elizabethan England was not like that.
No, and by all accounts, so, he really, whether you believe he was murdered, some believe he committed suicide, some believe that his death was faked and he went off into secrecy for a while. Regardless of what you believe happened in 1604, what we see leading up to 1604 is a man who is aging, who is gracefully slipping into retirement and becomes more concerned, as I would argue, becomes more concerned with his identity as a spouse and a father, and also the writer that he is. And I think he was doing a lot of work on putting together his 4-print versions of these plays for posterity's sake. And I think he becomes more concerned about those aspects of his identity than the title Earl of Oxford, Lord Balbec, and all the others that are part of his name.
Right.
You
Battlesmere. Yes, yes. Yeah, and I think you're right. I noticed that for myself, hanging out with my grandchildren is the thing. And, I've got other writing projects going on, but you do begin to think more of your family and your legacy. But by the time of Lord Oxford's death, however, or disappearance, whatever you want to call it, I think he is looking towards this legacy, this how will I be remembered? A wounded name. There's a sonnet. Right now it's not coming to my mind, but
Where's Hank Whittemore when you need him? He would spout off every sonnet that he would know exactly what sonnet. He'd be able to recite it line for line.
Oh, yes. Okay. But there's one line that says, my name be buried where
correct.
My body is. And right now I don't have the number of that. But I would.
Hank's listening right now and shouting the number at his radio or his headphones or however he's listening in the car or however he's listening to this right now. He's shouting the numbers at us.
Oh, I'm ashamed I don't have the number. I'm going to say 87, but I don't know that I'm right. Anyway, so I think you're right about taking stock at reaching a certain. He's also lame. He's also stabbed in the leg at Blackfriars Stairs by I had to make this up if you're interested, that he's stabbed by the uncles and some cousins of
it's Nivet, right? It's the Nivet. Yeah.
Knivet. Maybe it's Nivet. I've always thought of Knivet and the knife. It's like,
I don't know.
Oh my gosh,
I'm not sure if the K is silent or not, but
I don't know either. But why? And so my thing was, well, why would they do this? And she has the baby and names it after the Earl of Oxford, who's actually still kind of married to Anne Cecil and the whole Burleigh thing. And so my take on that in the novel is that the Queen refused to give him a divorce from his Protestant wife, Anne Cecil. And Anne Vavasor was a Catholic who names the baby after him. And it looks like, too, that he treats this child it very similarly to the way he treated the others who were natural children, not natural in that sense, but they were his recognized children. And then there was this other one. And why would this happen? Suppose he had promised to marry the Catholic mistress, believing that the queen would have said, all right, okay, we will do that. We will let you have your divorce. And so if in my book, it was an attack based on a promise of marriage that wasn't.
Well, and bastardy is also
breach of
another
promise of
major
marriage.
theme that we see again and again throughout the works of Shakespeare. The issue of bastardy and the definition of bastardy
Yes.
is something that continues to play out through multiple characters in the canon. And so, again, you have this identity aspect of it, and in many ways he's saying, well, if you think of what Edmund says, what is bastard? What is that name bastard?
Right.
You have characters in the plays who accuse others of being bastards in order to try to accomplish some sort of gain for themselves or to diminish the claim of someone who is a threat to them. And we see this happen in Edward's life as well, where his own sister accused him of being a bastard at one point in his lifetime, which I believe was a calculated move involving finance and not anything else. That's my particular slant on it. I think she knew that Burleigh was going to take all that money, and if she could claim her brother was a bastard, then he could not become the royal ward that he became, and Burleigh wouldn't be able to get his hands on all of those estates and all that property. I think that was the motivation there. But
see, that's interesting because we don't know necessarily what it is, but look at how you have just drawn a plot line, a plot device, that there was some reason going on. But then he writes this poem. It's Oxford has all these writings from when he was a young man. And there's nothing like that for Shakespeare, who signed his name apparently 6 different ways.
Because I always do that.
And I
always like to sign my name different ways just to confuse people.
Sure. Try doing that on a tax form and see what happens. Oh God. But I mean, we have this poem that he wrote about being declared a bastard. There's so many good books. I mean, there's a bibliography. And by the way, when my husband Peter and I were working on this, we would take the Earl of Oxford to bed. He was our pillow talk. And so we would talk about this all the time, about why certain things might have gone one way and might have gone another way. And that's how you do it.
That's quite all right. My wife and I
You
very
know?
commonly have those same late night discussions about Shakespeare and the works of Shakespeare. Usually it's about characters and scenes in the plays or a rehearsal that we've just come off of, or, blocking the choices we've made or whatever. But yeah, we are definitely Shakespeare nerds. It's one of the things that binds us together in our great love affair. So I totally understand.
Yeah, I believe it. It's exactly how it is when you're full partners with the person that you love. I
think Oxford understands this at one point, eventually through his life, he understands this. And that's why I say, I think his identity changed very drastically through his life. And, here's a man who, want to talk about signatures, had a very flowery, very specific signature that was basically a piece of art every time. And then, later on in life, it becomes less flowery. And I often wonder, if he lived today, how his email signature might have changed over time. And maybe we should all learn a lesson from that. Maybe, I think I'm going to change my email signature block. Maybe we should all take a note of this and change our email signature blocks and include father, husband, great friend, as opposed to, director of this or president of that or leader of this or this emeritus or whatever it is that we add at the bottoms of our names ad nauseum sometimes. Maybe we should all change instead of listing our pronouns too, because that's a big thing we're seeing everywhere. Maybe we should just be listing our personal relationship titles that we're most proud of. Grandparent. I'd love to see the next email you send me. I would love for it at the bottom for it to say grandparent,
Oh, I've got a title for myself relating to being a grandparent that you will see when I email you I'm going to look for the play in my files. I don't know if I can find the paper. I will figure this out and get you the play, The Adventures of Master F.I., which I decided to title A Pleasant Conceit, which there was a play supposedly by De Vere presented at Elizabeth's court that was called A Pleasant Conceit by De Vere. So, anyway, I'm going to dig this
awesome.
up for you,
I'll
buddy.
love to see it. I know Hank Whittemore has a one-man monodrama that he wrote and created that he's working on refashioning so that it could be performed by any actor and not be quite so autobiographical to him. And I know that Ron Destro has a 3-man play out there that is a very funny, very good piece of theater that I would like to see performed on the stage, maybe even at a Shakespeare Authorship Question conference or event of some sort. And it involves this, dialogue between Shakespeare and Oxford and a third person who's sort of like the narrator of the debate between them. I would love to see that performed on the stage. I think that the more of these types of works that we can get out there, get performed, even if it's, YouTube performances that can be properly staged and filmed and, not like a Zoom thing, but actual, multiple camera angle type of a thing and a quality presentation, I think that we'll see that audiences, not unlike 400 years ago, respond better to visual and characters upon the stage or the screen than they often will respond to, a professor or a lecturer spouting facts and details that tend to make the mind go cloudy in ways,
That's interesting because The Adventures of Master F.I., as it's written in I believe it's the last section of Hundred Sundry Flowers, it's a satire on Queen Elizabeth and all of her lovers. So you've got a two-story stage like the Merchant of Venice or whatever, the traditional two-story stage, and people running in and out of bedrooms and doors, and it's not Noises Off, but
you say it's an early George S. Kaufman work. Is that what we're?
Yes, I think that it is. It's very witty, and again, a lot of the phrases that are from mostly As You Like It are in this story, and I didn't put them there. They're in this piece called The Adventures of Master F.I. that was attributed to George Gascoigne in 1573, but not, and a lot of people believe it's one of the Earl of Oxford's works.
Kaufman was famous for believing that silence in comedy was death and that there always needed to be sound going on, and thus the door slamming comedies of that era that became so popular, that then led to plays later on, like you mentioned, like Noises Off, which is obviously hilarious door slamming play. Neil Simon also has Rumors, which is a great door slammer comedy. So yeah, I'm very interested. I can't wait to receive that from you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I will find it and
well,
get
Syril,
it to you.
I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join me and to share with my listeners part of your process and the insight into your novel. It is called Shakespeare's Changeling, ladies and gentlemen. If you'd like to find it, you can find it. It's available out there at all of your regular online book distribution locations, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc. It is available in digital form as well. I did see it pop up as a potential Nook book. So if you like to read on your device, you can download it from most of the available booksellers as well. Or you can get yourself, if you're old-fashioned like me and you like to have an actual copy in your hand, you can order it and have one sent to you as well. Shakespeare's Changeling, and it is Syril Kline. That's Kline if you're looking for Syril online.
And it's an award winner. It's the only one I know that's a book about the Earl of Oxford. So they won an award. So
that's fantastic. And how wonderful and proud of you to be an award-winning author regarding the Shakespeare Authorship Question. I think that's fantastic.
Thank you.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is time to announce the Quiller of the Month. To select the Quiller of the Month, I'd like to let you all know how we do that. We use a free software platform called Wheel of Names, sort of like Wheel of Fortune. It's a random name selector. Some people use it for like their fantasy sports leagues to designate the draft series and lineup, I think. And some people use it. I know my family is a large family, and it's difficult to buy Christmas presents for everyone. And so portions of my family use a similar system when they're drawing names for Christmas time and who's going to buy who a gift for that year. So we use Wheel of Names. We put everybody's name into the system, and it does a random selection. And this month's Quillers were in the system, and the system selected listener John Creider as the Quiller of the Month. John, congratulations. We will be contacting you with details on how to receive your prize. It will be an item of your choice from the Quiller Swag Shop. So watch for an email to come your way, John, with details on how to redeem your prize. And I'd like to conclude today's episode with a few shout outs to some other loyal Quillers who have recently written to me. Listener Lori Lawless wrote to ask if any of the fellow Quillers out there have done any extensive research into Touchstone's use of the Latin term ipsi, probably ipse. Touchstone uses the term ipse when he's interacting with the character William in As You Like It. And Lori would like to know if anyone's done any deep research into that. If you have, please write to me if you're interested in being a future guest to discuss that topic and aspects of Oxford's autobiographical connection to As You Like It. And thank you, Lori, for writing in the question. Listener Dean Bradley recently sent me a link to a very interesting news story about an Australian man who claims to be the illegitimate love child of Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles. His name is Simon Durante Day, and he's attracted headlines around the world with his love child claims, which he says are the result of decades of his own research into his own past. Dean's argument points to the credibility of Durante Day and his story, and Dean asks if royals could possibly hide an illegitimate child in the mass media world of the 1960s, then couldn't they have also hidden an illegitimate child in the late 16th century when it would have been so much easier to conceal? And that's a great question, Dean. Thanks for writing. And listeners who wish to know more can research Simon Durante Day online and find information about that. It's a very interesting story. If you want to write to me, you can too. Send me an email, contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com, contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. And it is don'tquillthepodcast.com if you want to go and click on our Patreon link to become an official member of the Quiller Nation and a patron of the show. We would love to see you do that and help us keep the show going. Head to don'tquillthepodcast.com, click on the Patreon link, and find a variety of exclusive perks only available to patrons, including those monthly bonus features. And remember, this month's bonus feature is going to include famous lovers in the canon and some discussion of the difference between juvenile love and mature love. I want to once again thank my guest for this episode, Syril Kline. Find her book, Shakespeare Changeling at booksellers everywhere. And until next time, fellow Quillers, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.